The quiet ones are always the most dangerous. That was the first thing Dr. Marcus Hargrove noticed about Katie Morrison on a Tuesday morning in March, though he wouldn't admit it to himself for another 3 weeks. She moved through Sacred Heart Hospital's ICU like someone who had already died once and decided the experience wasn't worth repeating. No unnecessary words. No eye contact. No ambition written across her face in the form of eager questions or committee volunteer sign-ups. Just competence. Relentless, methodical competence. The kind that made a man like Hargrove, a man whose entire secondary income depended on procedural codes that didn't quite match the work performed, on consultant billings for opinions never given, on a carefully orchestrated dance of phantom consultations and inflated severity indicators, deeply, quietly uncomfortable. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she knew. Sacred Heart smells like antiseptic layered over something older, something that no amount of industrial bleach can fully erase. It smells like fear that has soaked into the walls. The fluorescent lights hum at a frequency just below the threshold of conscious perception, but your nervous system hears it anyway, registers it as threat. Katie Morrison had learned to use that frequency as a metronome. 37 years old. 12 years in the Navy. 3 tours overseas. 2 Purple Hearts folded in a drawer at home next to a childhood photograph she hadn't looked at since 2004. She'd kept her head down at Sacred Heart for 3 years now, working the night shift, avoiding the administrative meetings where people like Hargrove built their empires one small lie at a time. Her personnel file listed her previous employment as contract medical services, undisclosed locations. Her references were Pentagon routing numbers that no longer existed. Senior Chief Petty Officer Morrison didn't officially exist anymore. The records had been sealed, redacted, and buried under classified operations paperwork after Kandahar, after the school, after everything that the Department of Defense had decided would be better served as silence. She preferred it that way. Room 347 was at the end of the ICU's east corridor, where the light seemed to dim by 5 degrees and the sound dampening felt almost intentional. Patient name, Marcus Webb. Age, 47. Diagnosis, traumatic brain injury with expressive aphasia. Chart notation, nonverbal, sustained IED blast to temporal lobe, 2007, Fort Irwin Trauma Clinic, subsequent vocal cord damage. No family on file. No emergency contact. Only a Purple Heart citation and a jaw that had been reconstructed by a surgeon who'd done good work. Katie had been assigned to his care 3 weeks ago, and something about the way his eyes tracked her movements had set off the warning systems that lived in her hindbrain, the ones that had kept her alive through 2 deployments and half a dozen close calls. The morning air in room 347 is cool, the ventilator pushing steady breaths at 16 per minute, the chest rise perfect and symmetrical. Katie checks the 4-line first, 18-gauge in the left antecubital fossa, sight clean, no infiltration, no discoloration. She runs her fingers along the tubing with the efficiency of someone whose hands have performed this task approximately 4,000 times. The 4-bag shows 340 milliliters remaining. She notes the time, 6:24 a.m. Her documentation will be precise. Every milliliter. Every minute. Every vital sign double-checked against the monitor display and recorded in her own cramped handwriting before the digital system corrupts it into some other number, some other story. Marcus Webb's eyes open as she adjusts the flow rate. They're the color of worn bronze, and they're fixed on her face with an intensity that makes her pause. She doesn't look directly at him. She's learned not to. She replaces his water pitcher instead, sets it within his reach on the bedside table, makes note that his fine motor coordination is improving. He managed to lift the cup yesterday without tremor. But then her eyes catch on something. A scar. Thin. Surgical. White with age. Running vertically along the right side of his neck for approximately 2 inches, terminating just below his ear. She's seen that scar before. She's seen it on a child who was 8 years old, who had been trapped under a collapsed wall in a school in the Jolan district of Kandahar city, who had bled into Katie's arms during a 3-mile evacuation to an extraction point while helicopter rotors screamed overhead and her own hands pressed against wounds she could barely comprehend. Her hand steadied. The trembling lasted half a second. She turned back to the monitor as if she hadn't seen anything, as if her nervous system wasn't suddenly recalibrating everything it knew about this room, this patient, this decision to keep her head down and her past buried. "You're doing well," she says, her voice measured and soft, the kind of voice she's perfected over 3 years at Sacred Heart. Deferential. Unthreatening. The voice of someone who knows she doesn't belong in a place like this, who is grateful for the work and the paycheck and the ability to disappear into routine. Pain level still at 2. He can't answer. The expressive aphasia destroyed that capacity. But his eyes move, once to the left, then back to center. The hospital's nonverbal communication protocol lists this as affirmative. Katie makes the notation on his chart. 6:52 a.m. Pain level 2/10. Respiratory status stable. Fluid intake adequate. She doesn't write that his eyes held her gaze for exactly 4 seconds longer than necessary. She doesn't write that recognition flickered there, a question she wasn't prepared to answer. The medication cart arrives at 7:04 a.m., pushed by a nursing aide named Derek who always forgets to lock the wheels. Katie pulls it to the side of room 347 and begins cross-referencing her patient assignments against the medication drawer. This is where she's developed a reputation for meticulousness that borders on obsessive. This is where the first seeds of Hargrove's unease were planted. Patient Marcus Webb. Scheduled medication, 500 mg of levetiracetam for seizure prophylaxis. Dosage listed in the chart. Katie pulls the bottle and verifies, 500 mg tablets, take 1 twice daily. But the order in the digital system says 750 mg, twice daily. She checks the paper order that came from Dr. Hargrove's office. 500 mg. She checks the chart notation from yesterday's evening shift, Katie's own handwriting showing 500 mg administered at 1900 hours. She makes a yellow sticky note and attaches it to the chart. Dosage discrepancy, digital order shows 750 mg, paper order and chart document show 500 mg. Please clarify before administration. This is what she does. This is what she's always done, even back when it was classified, back when getting the details right meant the difference between an operative coming home and a flag-draped coffin. Documentation is sacred. Precision is survival. But in hospitals, precision sometimes reads as suspicion. It reads as someone who doesn't trust the system. It reads as someone who's paying attention to things she shouldn't be paying attention to. At 7:31 a.m., Dr. Marcus Hargrove arrives for morning rounds. His white coat is tailored, actual tailoring, not department store approximation. His tie costs more than Katie's weekly grocery budget. His smile arrives before he does, a thing that has learned to deploy itself on command without requiring any corresponding emotion from the muscles underneath. He carries a tablet that shows his preferred patient rotation and the billing codes he's already mentally calculated for each case. He pauses outside room 347 and reviews the chart. His eye catches on the yellow sticky note attached to the medication order. His jaw tightens for exactly 1 second. Katie, who is updating the full log at the nursing station 15 feet away, sees this. She doesn't look away quickly enough. He registers that she's noticed him noticing the discrepancy. "Morrison," he says, his voice carrying the particular tone that physicians reserve for nurses they suspect might ask inconvenient questions. "A word." Katie sets down her pen. She stands. The limp she carries from a round of shrapnel that embedded itself in her left hip 3 days before her medical discharge registers in her gait, barely perceptible unless you're looking for it. She moves toward him with the posture of someone who has learned that appearing smaller is sometimes tactically superior to appearing strong. "The medication order," she says. The digital entry shows 750 mg, but the paper order and the chart document indicate 500 mg. "I wanted to verify before administration." Hargrove smiles like a man who has just been accused of something and is deciding how much offense to take. The chart's been updated, he says. Increased the dose yesterday based on his seizure activity. Digital system just hasn't caught up yet. These things lag sometimes. Katie nods once. She doesn't argue. She's learned that arguing with authority tends to end with your personnel file suddenly developing negative reviews. She turns back toward the medication cart. But something in her peripheral vision catches Hargrove's hand still holding the tablet, his pupils dilated, his breathing pattern just slightly elevated. He's running calculations. She can see it happening. He's assessing her, measuring her, deciding whether she represents a problem that needs solving or just a minor inconvenience that will fade with time. Good catch, though, he adds, and the smile comes back. Attention to detail. That's what we need here. The words are kind. But his eyes are running the numbers, and the numbers are saying something very different. The numbers are saying that Katie Morrison pays too much attention to inconsistencies. The numbers are saying that someone who double-checks medication orders against chart documentation is someone who might, at some point, start double-checking other things. Billing codes. Consultant fees. The careful architecture of phantom procedures and inflated severity designations that have, over the past 4 years, generated approximately $847,000 in supplementary income for a man who earns $312,000 annually from his hospital salary alone. At 8:15 a.m., Katie returns to room 347 to administer the levetiracetam at the correct dose, 500 milligrams, as documented in the paper order and the chart notes. She crushes the tablet, mixes it with applesauce, and administers it through the feeding tube with the precision of someone following a protocol that has been written in her muscle memory by thousands of repetitions. Marcus Webb's eyes track her movement. The day shift will monitor you, she says, her voice still soft, still deferential, still the voice of someone who knows she doesn't belong in a place like this. If you need anything, use the call button. He can't respond verbally. But his hand moves, just a millimeter, and his fingers flex once. Katie's shoulders go rigid for a half second before she controls it, before she smooths her expression back into professional neutrality and exits the room without looking back. What she doesn't see is the way his eyes close after she leaves. What she doesn't hear is the silence that follows, heavy with the weight of 2 decades compressed into a moment of recognition that neither of them is prepared to acknowledge. By 10:33 a.m., Dr. Hargrove has already made 2 phone calls. The first to a board member whose cardiac practice he'd referred approximately $400,000 in patient cases over the past 3 years. The second to the HR coordinator, an innocuous call asking whether there were any personnel updates he should be aware of regarding his ICU nursing staff. The message was subtle. The message was clear. The message was, there is a nurse in my unit who pays too much attention to details, and I'm wondering whether we should consider whether her employment status might need reviewing. Room 319 was quiet except for the cardiac monitor's steady beep and the rustle of paper. Katie had documented Mr. Chen's vitals twice, 1,400 hours and 1,600 hours, each entry in her tight, precise handwriting on page 3 of the chart. She knew this because she had written it. She also knew that Dr. Hargrove was about to pretend she hadn't. He stood at the foot of the bed, white coat draped over his shoulders like a cape, holding the chart open with one hand. Mr. Chen's daughter and son-in-law flanked him, their faces eager to believe whatever authority was about to tell them. Katie was checking the 4-line, her movements mechanical, her attention divided between 2 tasks at once, the work and the ambush she could see forming like storm clouds. Nurse Morrison. Hargrove's voice carried the particular timbre of a man performing competence for an audience. Can you explain why Mr. Chen's 1,400 vitals aren't documented? Katie's hands didn't pause. Before tubing was patent, fluid running clear. She turned to face him, her expression neutral as still water. They're documented on page 3, Doctor. Along with the 1,600 check. He flipped the page. His jaw tightened for exactly 1/10 of a second, the moment where he realized the documentation existed, the moment where he had to choose between acknowledging the error or pushing forward anyway. He pushed forward. "Your disorganization is causing confusion," he said, addressing the family now instead of Katie. "Do better." The daughter nodded sympathetically at Katie, as though Katie had just been gently corrected for something she'd done wrong. The son-in-law studied his shoes. Mr. Chen watched from the bed, his pale face showing nothing, though his fingers had begun picking at his blanket corner, a sign of distress that Katie registered and filed away. Katie took one measured breath. In through her nose. The room smelled like antiseptic and the particular staleness of recirculated hospital air, the same staleness that never quite left your clothes no matter how many times you washed them. She had smelled worse. She had stood in medical tents where gangrene rotted the air itself, where dying men tried to laugh so the ones next to them wouldn't lose hope. One tear escaped from her left eye. Just one. It traced down her cheek like it was following a map it had memorized long ago. Katie wiped it away with the back of her hand before it could fall, her eyes never leaving Hargrove's face. "I've survived worse than you, Doctor," she said quietly. And those people had actual courage. The room went silent. The kind of silence that had weight. The cardiac monitor continued its methodical beeping, the only sound that seemed to have permission to exist. Hargrove's jaw tightened again, but this time it stayed tight. He turned away from her, his movement sharp, and left the room with the chart still in his hand. The family exchanged glances, uncertain whether something had just been said that mattered or whether they'd imagined the shift in the air. Katie finished checking me for, adjusted the flow rate, documented it. Her hands were steady. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and the ghost of 100 microwaved lunches. Katie entered at 1,230 hours with a paper bag containing a turkey sandwich and an apple she had no intention of eating. 3 nurses sat at the corner table, Morrison, no relation, Chen, and Washington, all of them pulling charts from the afternoon assignment board. None of them looked up when Katie came in. She sat at the table across the room, pulled the sandwich out of the bag, and opened it. The bread was dry. She would eat it anyway. Morrison stood first. She set down her coffee, made a small non-committal noise, and walked out without looking at Katie. 30 seconds later, Chen followed her. 10 seconds after that, Washington gathered her scrubs, she had been on her break, and left as well. The door swung shut behind her with a hydraulic hiss. Katie was alone under the fluorescent light that had been humming the same tired note for 6 months. The light buzzed. The refrigerator in the corner kicked on with a mechanical groan. A cooking show played on the wall-mounted television, 2 people laughing silently about something that required no sound. She took a bite of the sandwich. Then another. Mechanical. Methodical. The kind of eating that soldiers do when they need fuel, not sustenance, when the meal is just another checkpoint between one task and the next. She finished half of it and threw the rest away, wrapped the apple back in the bag, and returned to the unit. Nobody had looked at her. That was the worst part. Not the silence or the absence or the synchronized exit. The worst part was the way they had all managed to inhabit the same room with her without acknowledging that she occupied space. The disciplinary write-up was posted on the unit board at 1,400 hours, printed on official Sacred Heart letterhead, laminated so it would survive repeated handling. The title appeared in bold at the top of the page, Morrison, K., Formal Warning, Insubordination and Poor Team Dynamics. 6 staff members clustered around it when Katie arrived for her 1500 shift, their conversation dropping to whispers the moment her badge cleared the security scanner. She watched them scatter like birds, watched them find urgent business in other parts of the unit, watched the way their eyes avoided hers as they passed. Then she stepped forward and read it once, her face stone, her breathing steady. The accusations were precise. Detailed. The kind of document that someone who understood hospital procedure had written with careful attention to making it sound official. There were 3 specific incidents listed: an interaction with the respiratory therapist on September 14th, a disagreement with the pharmacy on September 19th, and her comments to Dr. Hargrove in room 319 just hours earlier. The language was bureaucratic poison, demonstrates poor judgment, unable to work collaboratively, creates hostile environment. Katie took one measured breath. She was reading the second paragraph when Dr. Hargrove appeared at her elbow, coffee in hand, moving as though they were old friends who had just happened to meet by the bulletin board. "Unfortunate, but necessary," he said. His voice carried the certainty of a man who had already won. "You're simply not a culture fit, Candy Striper." The nickname landed like a physical thing. Candy Striper. The old volunteer uniforms from the 1970s, the ones used to describe medical personnel who weren't real nurses, who were just pretty girls in pink striped uniforms helping for college credit. He had weaponized her gender and her career in 5 syllables. Katie turned to face him. She didn't raise her voice. When you had trained with people who communicated across hostile territory in single whispers that traveled a mile through midnight air, you learned that volume meant nothing. Precision meant everything. "I've carried men 3 miles with worse than you'll ever face, Doctor." She paused. 1 second. 2. "You have no idea what culture means." His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A calculation. A reassessment. For the first time, Katie saw him register that she wasn't going to break the way he had assumed she would break. That there was something underneath her scrubs and her quiet compliance that he hadn't accounted for in his strategic planning. She walked to her station and began pulling up her patient assignment. Behind her, Hargrove stood at the bulletin board, staring at the back of her head as though he could bore through it and see what was hidden inside. The commotion from the ICU started at 1,530 hours. Shouting. Multiple voices. The particular chaos that erupted when security had to be called, but the threat wasn't immediate, the messy, uncontrolled kind of crisis that made the hair on the back of Katie's neck stand up. She was checking medication carts when the sound cut through the unit like an alarm, and then she heard it, Pashto. The language hit her like a fist made of memory and adrenaline and things she had spent 20 years trying to keep buried in the space between her ribs. A crash cart wheeled past her station. 2 security officers jogging. Someone paged for the hospital administrator. Katie's hands continued moving through the medication cabinet, muscle memory taking over, her brain compartmentalizing the sound into a section labeled "Not for processing right now." She had learned to do this a long time ago, in a place that had taught her that your body could continue functioning while your mind stood very still. By 1545, the word had circulated, a refugee patient admitted for a rare blood disorder, a former Taliban commander, now cleared for asylum by the State Department. He had begun screaming the moment he saw the nursing staff. PTSD, the administrator decided. Paranoid delusion. The hospital psychiatrist was consulted. Medication was ordered. The man was sedated, and the situation was classified as managed. But Katie understood what the others didn't. The screaming had been specific. He hadn't been confused or hallucinating or suffering from symptoms that mimicked those conditions. He had been identifying someone. And the language he had screamed in was the language of the place where she had become something other than a person, something that existed in files the Pentagon had marked classified and then burned. She moved through the rest of her shift like a ghost moving through walls. Her patients received excellent care. Her documentation was flawless. Her presence occupied space without demanding anything from it. When she passed the ICU, she kept her eyes forward. When she heard Pashto from sedated lips, she didn't slow her pace. Room 347 was different. The mute Marine had been sitting up, his spine straight against the pillows, his eyes tracking every person who moved past his doorway. When Katie entered, his shoulders dropped. His hands, which had been clenched on the bed rail, relaxed enough to pick up the small notepad he used to communicate with staff. He wrote something in large letters, "He's here for you." Katie looked at the words. Then she crumpled the paper, the sound sharp and deliberate in the quiet room. "No one's here for me," she said. Her voice came out steady, but that was a lie. Her voice came out the way it had always come out when she refused to let anyone see that the ground underneath her was moving. "I don't exist." The Marine's eyes held hers for a long moment. He reached for another piece of paper, wrote one word, liar. Katie took his vitals without responding. Blood pressure normal. Heart rate steady. O2 saturation excellent. The vital signs of a man whose body was healing, even if the rest of him was stuck in the moment where his voice had been stolen from him by the same blast that had stolen 2 other men from his unit. She documented everything in his chart, then stood at the window of room 347 and watched the San Diego skyline begin to soften as evening approached. Behind her, the Marine continued to sit up straight, his eyes still tracking the hallway, a silent vigil over something he understood better than anyone else in the building. That evening, Katie saw that her personnel file had been pulled. She noticed it because the HR coordinator's desk usually kept files in locked cabinets, but hers had been left out, empty except for 3 pages, her employment application, her signed confidentiality agreement, and a note flag asking for supplemental background verification. The folder itself was open, waiting. The message was clear: Hargrove was building something. The documentation was already underway. Katie finished her shift and drove home with the radio off, watching the street lights blur past, her hand steady on the wheel, her breathing measured. She had survived worse than this. But the thing about surviving worse was that it never got easier. It just got more familiar. The monitor's steady beep turned irregular at 1,400 hours. Katie caught it first, that subtle shift in rhythm that meant something fundamental had changed. Board Chairman Williamson lay in post-op observation, dressed in the standard hospital gown, his chest rising and falling with effort that shouldn't have required effort. He'd made it through cardiac surgery without complications. Now, 4 hours later, his body was telling a different story. Katie approached the bedside with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. Williamson's wife sat in the corner chair, scrolling her phone, convinced her husband was simply resting. His 2 adult children had stepped out for coffee 20 minutes ago. The room felt like it was holding its breath. She placed her fingers on his wrist. Pulse racing, 140 beats per minute. His skin was cool despite the heated blanket draped across his legs. She leaned in, stethoscope already in her ears, pressing the diaphragm against his right side. Nothing. Complete absence of breath sounds where there should have been the whisper of air moving through healthy lungs. The left side was clear, in pneumothorax, then air in the pleural space, collapsing the right lung, compressing the mediastinum, crushing the heart's ability to fill properly. Tension pneumothorax. 11 years of field medicine in Kandahar had taught her to recognize this before vital signs screamed it, before the body shut down. She straightened, jaw tight but expression neutral, and reached for the monitor controls. Blood pressure, 98/62 and dropping. Oxygen saturation, 91% and falling. Trachea, she palpated gently at the neck, deviated slightly to the left. The heart was losing its duel with the expanding pneumothorax. The intercom crackled when she paged. Stat to observation room 347, see Dr. Hargrove, stat. 30 minutes. That's how long it took for Dr. Hargrove to respond via video call. 30 minutes while Williamson's oxygen fell to 88%, while his blood pressure bottomed out at 84/48, while Katie performed every non-invasive assessment available to her without crossing the line that would cost her career. She'd drawn the curtain halfway, minimizing visibility, keeping the room calm enough that Williamson's wife didn't realize her husband was dying in front of her. The tablet appeared on the bedside table, propped against a stack of monitor cables. Dr. Hargrove's face filled the screen, tanned, relaxed, a margarita visible on the surface behind him. The rotor wash of a boat engine vibrated through the tablet speaker. He was somewhere off the coast of Mexico, 200 miles from his patient, dressed in a linen shirt unbuttoned to the sternum. He looked at the screen without looking at Williamson. Status report, Morrison. Katie's voice came out level, the voice of someone reporting facts, not panic. Decreased breath sounds on right side. Tracheal deviation to the left. O2 sat 88 and falling. Blood pressure 94/50. Heart rate 142. Progression started at 1400 hours, accelerating. Hargrove leaned back in his deck chair. She could see the ocean behind him, could hear him sipping his drink. His eyes didn't move to the monitor readings on the screen beside his own image. It's anxiety, Morrison. Post-operative anxiety. He said it with the absolute certainty of a man who had never been questioned. Push 2 milligrams of Ativan. He'll calm down. Vitals will stabilize. Katie's hands didn't move. Sir, the clinical presentation indicates tension pneumothorax. The trachea is deviated. The breath sounds are completely absent on the right side. This is not anxiety. A pause. Hargreaves' expression shifted, not to concern but to irritation. The kind of irritation a man feels when the help doesn't obey instructions. Are you a physician, Nurse Morrison? I don't recall seeing an MD after your name on the hospital roster. No, sir. Then you'll follow my treatment protocol. 2 milligrams of Ativan, for push. Now. Katie's jaw clenched. A muscle in her neck tightened like a violin string. But her voice remained steady. Doctor, his oxygen saturation is dropping. This will make it worse. I don't care if you think. Hargrove's voice rose, then caught itself. He adjusted his tone to something colder, more dangerous. You follow orders, or I'll have you escorted from this unit within the hour. Your choice, Morrison. Anxiety medication or unemployment. Move. He ended the call. The tablet went dark. Williamson's wife looked up from her phone, confused by the sudden silence. Is everything okay? Katie's answer came without hesitation. Your husband is resting. I'm just checking his medications. The lie was smooth because it had to be. Because the alternative was watching this man's heart stop while she stood there with her hands empty. Because she'd spent 3 years at Sacred Heart hiding who she was, and somewhere in that hiding, she'd forgotten that the oath to do no harm didn't have an expiration date when a superior gave orders. Williamson's oxygen saturation dropped to 84%. The room shifted. Katie's peripheral vision sharpened, the predator's vision, the kind that comes when everything else falls away. She could see the monitor clearly now, could see the patient's chest barely moving, could see the wife picking up her phone to call for help. But help wouldn't come fast enough. Help never came fast enough in the room where nobody would speak up first. She turned to the door and called out, her voice carrying the weight of authority in a way it hadn't carried anything before. I need respiratory in here now. And 2 additional nurses. Move. They came because something in her tone made movement the only reasonable response. The respiratory therapist wheeled his cart in first, a man named Chen who'd worked beside her for 2 years without knowing anything about her. Behind him came Jennifer, the charge nurse, and Marcus from the MedSurg unit. They assembled around the bed with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this before, who understood that crisis was just organization under pressure. Katie pulled the curtain fully closed. Williamson's wife stood, frightened now, comprehending finally that something had moved beyond routine. One of his children appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sudden activity. The room was becoming crowded, 8 people now, all of them breathing the same recycled air, all of them waiting for someone to explain what was happening. None of them understanding that Katie had about 90 seconds to make a choice that would determine everything that came after. She moved to the supply cabinet, muscle memory, the kind of muscle memory that doesn't ask permission. Her hands found the needle decompression kit without hesitation, without thought. A 14-gauge angiocath needle, long enough to reach through the chest wall into the pleural space. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. The textbook position. The position where, if she was right, air would hiss out like a pressure valve releasing. The position where, if she was wrong, she'd be finished at Sacred Heart before sunset. Jennifer's voice came sharp. Katie, what are you doing? Katie looked up from the kit. For the first time, her eyes held something different. Not defiance, something colder. My job. Williamson's oxygen saturation hit 82%. His heart rate climbed to 156. The agonal breathing, the body's last desperate attempt to pull oxygen from a collapsing lung, was the sound of a man running out of time. Katie swabbed his chest wall with antiseptic, the smell of iodine sharp and acrid, mixing with the hospital's underlying scent of bleach and old air. Williamson's eyes were wide with fear, but he couldn't speak, couldn't ask what was happening. His wife had both hands over her mouth. One of his children had turned away, unable to watch. The mute Marine from room 347 stood in the doorway. Nobody had seen him wheel himself down the corridor, but there he was, this silent man who couldn't speak but somehow always appeared when it mattered. His eyes met Katie's across the chaos of the room. He didn't nod. Didn't do anything visible. But in that moment, she understood that he knew exactly who she was, exactly what she was about to do, and that whatever came next, he would bear witness. Katie positioned the needle. The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous electric song. The monitor beeped its accelerating rhythm. The room held its breath like it was the one running out of oxygen. Her hands moved with the certainty of someone who had done this before, in places where there was no backup plan, no hospital board to answer to, no career to lose because the alternative to acting was death on your hands instead. She didn't hesitate. The needle went in. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. One smooth motion between the ribs where anatomy had taught her the pathway lay hidden. The 14-gauge angiocath needle slid through fascia and pleura with barely a whisper of resistance. The hiss came next, that unmistakable rush of pressurized air escaping from Chairman Williamson's collapsed lung, a sound like a tire deflating, like a held breath finally released. Katie didn't flinch at the noise. Didn't check for reactions. Her hands moved with the certainty of someone who had done this in the dust outside a forward operating base, in a clinic with no power and no backup, where the alternative to acting was a body bag labeled with a number instead of a name. The room held its breath with the air that escaped. The monitor's alarm pitch dropped incrementally, the oxygen saturation climbing on the screen, 72%. 78%. 84%. The 6 witnesses, 2 ICU nurses, the resident, the cardiology fellow, board chairman Williamson's terrified wife, and the mute Marine from room 347 standing in the corner like a silent sentinel, watched numbers climb toward normalcy. Katie's pen moved across the chart with the same steady hand that had written his vitals that morning, documenting the needle insertion time at 1,407 hours, the immediate response, the patient's breathing deepening as his lungs re-inflated with precious oxygen. The lines on the monitor began to steady themselves, no longer the chaotic peaks of a drowning patient but the reassuring rhythm of a man returning to his body. 92%. 96%. Williamson's wife made a sound that wasn't quite a word, her hand pressing against her mouth as her husband's color shifted from dusky gray back toward something approaching human. His wife wasn't the only one trembling in that room. 3 people had hands shaking. Katie's weren't among them. She'd calmly disposed of the needle, applied a dressing, begun the documentation that would protect him and protect herself in equal measure. The attending physician was called. The resident stared at her as though she'd grown a second head. The mute Marine nodded once, a gesture so small it almost didn't exist, and turned to leave the room. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes held something Katie recognized in her own reflection, the particular knowledge that comes from surviving impossible choices and living to document them afterward. By 1500 hours, word had begun moving through Sacred Heart's corridors the way hospital news always does, whispered in break rooms and coded into shift handovers. The new nurse had saved a board member's life. The quiet one. The one who kept her head down. But that wasn't the worst part from Dr. Hargrove's perspective. The worst part was the 6 witnesses. 6 people who had watched Katie Morrison, the nurse with gaps in her employment history and behavioral concerns, demonstrate the clinical acumen of a trauma surgeon and the composure of someone operating under fire. 6 people who could testify that his dismissal of her clinical assessment from a boat off Mexico had nearly cost a board member his life. Hargrove's phone was in his hand before he even reached the hospital parking lot, the engine of his sports car rumbling beneath him as he made calculations that had nothing to do with medicine. He'd built his fraud network over 15 years, small relationships compounded into a debt structure that protected him. Board member Chen owed him referrals for high-margin cardiac cases worth roughly $240,000 a year. Board member Rodriguez had personally benefited from Hargrove's management of his son's complex cardiac case 5 years ago, a case that had actually been managed by Katie and 2 other nurses while Hargrove consulted from a conference in Las Vegas. There was an HR investigator in San Diego named Vickers who'd helped 3 other physicians navigate personnel complications in exchange for surgical referrals worth money that moved through consulting contracts and speaking fees. The phone calls began at 1,507 hours. Katie could see Hargrove through the glass-walled corridor, boat shoes still on his feet, his jaw working as he spoke into his phone with the voice of someone accustomed to people answering when he called. She saw Chen's name light up the hospital directory when her colleague checked. Saw Hargrove's hand gesture as he moved deeper into the hallway, his voice taking on that particular cadence that meant he was calling in debts. The second call came at 15:09. Rodriguez answered immediately. The third call was to a number not in the hospital directory, Vickers, Katie assumed, the name she'd heard mentioned in administrator conversations that had never been meant to include her. By 15:30, Hargrove had made the calls that ensured Katie's references would be contacted by early evening. He knew her nursing school professor had retired 3 years ago, that tracking her down would be difficult and that any conversation would necessarily include the fact that Katie had somehow attended nursing school while her official employment history showed her in completely different cities during those same years. He knew the charge nurse from her previous hospital had transferred to Portland, Oregon, and that when called with vague questions about reliability concerns and behavioral issues, that nurse would say exactly what anyone says when asked for character references without specific context, measured uncertainty, the kind of pause that sounds like doubt to anyone listening for it. Katie sat across from Director Palmer at 18:47 hours, long after visiting hours had ended, long after the rest of the hospital had assumed the excitement of the afternoon had passed. Palmer's office was all soft colors and framed certifications, a space designed to feel supportive while delivering the least supportive news a career could receive. Palmer wouldn't meet her eyes, which was its own confirmation that this wasn't a conversation about recognizing heroism. This was about protecting the hospital from a liability it had only just realized it had. "Despite your heroic actions this afternoon," Palmer began, the words clearly rehearsed in a phone conversation with the hospital's legal team, "your pattern of behavioral issues and the concerning gaps in your employment history leave us no choice. 3 years essentially unaccounted for. References who couldn't verify your tenure at your previous facility. The disciplinary record on file. These are things that we, as a board-affiliated hospital, simply cannot overlook." Palmer's voice was gentle, which somehow made it worse. Gentle was the voice of someone who'd already made the decision and was simply executing paperwork. "We're terminating your employment effective immediately. Security will escort you to collect your personal items from your locker. Your final paycheck will include severance based on your 3 years of service." Katie's hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. She nodded once, a gesture that seemed to confuse Palmer, as though Katie was supposed to argue or cry or make this difficult. But Katie had survived worse than this in places where the ceiling wasn't climate-controlled and the fluorescent lights didn't hum their monotonous lullaby. She'd survived Kandahar. She'd survived the collapse of a school where children had been buried alive beneath concrete meant to shelter them. She'd survived being officially erased by the Pentagon. She could survive being fired by a hospital that had never actually known who she was. The security guard who walked her to her locker was the same man who'd greeted her on her first day 3 years ago, who'd always asked how her shift went, who'd watched her work that afternoon. His name was Marcus, and his face carried the particular disappointment of someone who'd just been told to do something he didn't want to do. Katie's locker was small and sparse, a change of scrub she rarely needed, a photo stuck to the inside of the door showing her unit in Kandahar, every face visible except the one she'd ordered crossed out in marker, the ones that didn't come home. At the bottom of the locker sat her boots, the pair that had carried her through for deployments, the left one still stained dark with blood that would never come clean. She packed everything into the cardboard box that Marcus held for her. A cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse," a gift from a coworker her first year. A dying succulent she'd tried to keep alive on the break room windowsill, slowly withering despite her best efforts. The photo from Kandahar. And at the very bottom, wrapped in an old PT shirt from her Navy days, the boots, salt-stained from sweat, scuffed from 1,000 miles of terrain that no one in San Diego would ever understand, marked permanently by a child's blood that represented 43 lives saved and an entire team lost. The rain started as soon as she cleared the hospital entrance. It fell in sheets against the parking lot, turning the asphalt into a mirror that reflected streetlights and headlights, turning the ordinary San Diego evening into something that felt like drowning above ground. Katie found the bus stop shelter 2 blocks away and sat on the bench, the cardboard box balanced on her lap like an infant she was learning to hold. The photo was pressed against the cracked mug. The succulent was pressed against the photo. The boots were pressed against the PT shirt, their worn leather darkening under the rain that found its way through the shelter's inadequate roof. She didn't cry. She'd learned not to cry in public in a place where tears could mean death, where emotion was a luxury that got people killed. The water on her face was rain. The tightness in her chest was rain. The way her breathing came shallow and controlled was rain. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the moment that split the world in two. That wasn't the moment when the thing she'd buried for 20 years, the thing the Pentagon had buried with her, the thing classified and redacted and officially erased, would step out of the rain and speak her name as though she'd never been invisible at all. 1 week later, Katie Morrison stood in a fluorescent-lit pharmacy aisle in a strip mall off El Cajon Boulevard, restocking bottles of metformin and lisinopril with mechanical precision. Her name tag read Catherine. Just Catherine. The cardboard box had been donated to a thrift store. The combat boots were still in her apartment, wrapped in the PT shirt, waiting in darkness like a classified file nobody was supposed to read. Her phone exploded at 2:11 p.m. Text messages cascaded in. Then calls. A group chat from the Sacred Heart ER staff, screenshots of a news story, headlines screaming across her screen. Federal investigation. Healthcare fraud. Hospital board members arrested. A photograph of Dr. Hargrove being led into a federal courthouse, his face the color of bleached gauze, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume someone had forced on a condemned man. Katie didn't open the links. She didn't need to. Her hand stayed steady, restocking bottles in alphabetical order, compartmentalizing the way she'd been trained to compartmentalize, 20 years of separating the things that had happened from the person she pretended to be when the sun came up. Then her pharmacy manager appeared at her shoulder. "Catherine, you might want to take a break. Check the news. Something's happening at Sacred Heart right now. Something big." She clocked out without speaking. By the time she drove back across the city, the story had crystallized into something that felt like fiction. A Taliban commander, former Taliban commander, refugee status granted by medical asylum, admitted to Sacred Heart's ICU that morning for pneumonia. The moment the nursing staff tried to move him to isolation, he'd started screaming in Pashto, his voice cracking across the hospital intercom system like a damaged recording. He was pointing at nurses, shouting that one of them had led the raid. That one of them had killed his brother in a classified operation in Kandahar 20 years ago. That she was a ghost who should have stayed buried. That she was American military pretending to be nobody. Security arrived. The commander was sedated. The hospital locked down. But when Katie pulled into the parking lot and walked through the ER doors, the lobby had transformed into something between a crime scene and a ceremony. Federal agents in Navy jackets. Uniformed hospital security. Board members being escorted out in handcuffs. And standing in the hallway outside the conference room, still wearing the visitor's pass they'd given him weeks ago, the mute Marine, the boy she'd carried 3 miles through enemy territory, the boy who'd grown into a man with eyes like storm warnings, stood perfectly still. She didn't recognize his face at first in that context. Then he turned toward her. And his mouth opened. Senior Chief Petty Officer. 3 words. His voice emerged rough as gravel, each syllable catching like machinery that hadn't moved in years. The hospital hallway seemed to compress around those 3 words. Nurses stopped. Agents turned. The sound was the first human voice anyone had heard from Marcus Webb in 36 months, and he'd used it to name her, not as a nurse, not as Catherine, not as the invisible woman who'd been erased from every database, every record, every official history. Senior Chief Petty Officer. An FBI agent appeared at the conference room door. Agent Delacourt. She was holding Katie's personnel file. Not her Sacred Heart file, the real one. The one with the Pentagon seal. The one that supposedly didn't exist. Katie didn't ask questions. She walked into the conference room like she was moving through a memory that wasn't hers yet. The file lay open on the table, pages scanned and projected onto the wall beside a laptop. Billing records. Procedure codes. Communications between Dr. Hargrove and 3 board members, text chains detailing split payments. 18 months. $2.3 million. Phantom consultations. Inflated codes. An elegant scheme built on the assumption that nobody would look too closely, that the quiet nurse in the corner would keep checking vitals and keep her mouth shut. What the scheme hadn't anticipated was Katie Morrison. What it hadn't anticipated was a woman trained to document everything, to flag inconsistencies, to catch the smallest deviation in a patient's condition. Every yellow sticker she'd placed on a chart. Every medication discrepancy she'd reported. Every billing code she'd questioned, all of it had been quietly forwarded to an undercover compliance officer embedded in Sacred Heart's administration. The FBI had been photographing her documentation for months while she was being humiliated. While she was being fired. While she was sitting in the rain with a cardboard box. A man in dress blue stood from a chair Katie hadn't noticed. Captain Reeves. His chest was a landscape of decorations, and his voice carried the weight of someone who'd made decisions that cost lives. Senior Chief Morrison, he said, and her rank fell from his mouth like he was reading from a memorial. Your service record has been unsealed. I'm here to present formal recognition of decorations held in suspension. He opened a leather folder. Bronze Star. He paused. Silver Star. Another pause. The room held its breath. Second Silver Star. His eyes remained steady on hers. Purple Heart. 2 of them. He closed the folder slightly, saving the final page. And a Navy Cross. The Navy Cross. The highest decoration a Navy enlisted sailor could receive. For heroism not in the line of duty, but beyond it. For doing what nobody had the authority to ask. For saving lives that nobody was supposed to acknowledge existed. Katie didn't move. She didn't blink. The composure held. Agent Delacourt stepped forward. We've been investigating this fraud for 9 months. Dr. Hargrove's network started collapsing 48 hours ago. Board member Chen provided text message chains. Rodriguez gave us recorded phone calls. Williams handed over spreadsheets documenting split payments. She played a recording from her phone. Hargrove's voice, 2 days old, speaking to someone at the state medical board. Attempting to have Katie's nursing license flagged. Claiming her credentials were fraudulent. Claiming her employment history was false. Making certain she could never work in healthcare again even after they'd already destroyed her. The pettiness of it hung in the air like poison. The vindictiveness. The refusal to simply win, he'd needed to ensure she stayed buried. The mute Marine spoke again. His voice was rough, but present. Present like a weapon being chambered. Senior Chief taught me that honor means protecting those who can't protect themselves. That doctor is the opposite of everything she represents. Director Palmer, who'd signed Katie's termination papers, started crying quietly into her hands. Then a voice came from the doorway. The security guard. The same man who'd handed Katie her cardboard box in the rain. He was carrying an identical box. In it were golf trophies. Diplomas. A framed photograph of Dr. Hargrove's boat. He walked past the conference table toward Hargrove's attorney, whose face had gone the color of medical gauze. The security guard set the box down with a sound like finality. "I believe you know the way out, Doctor," he said, his voice dead flat. "They tell me the community college is hiring CPR instructors, minimum wage, if you're interested." Hargrove was led out in federal custody 20 minutes later. Wire fraud. Healthcare fraud. Conspiracy. Witness intimidation. The charges multiplied like a diagnosis nobody caught until it was terminal. That evening, Katie stood at the window of her old unit, the sun setting over San Diego in bands of orange and purple that looked like something God had spilled. Her scrubs fit like a second skin. Her combat boots were back in her locker where they belonged, visible when she opened the door, a reminder of the child she'd saved, the girl she'd been, the person 20 years of erasure hadn't managed to kill. Marcus Webb stood at her shoulder. Silent guard. He's breathing steady. His presence the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst and from knowing exactly who was standing next to him now. "You saved me twice," Katie said quietly, watching the light fade across the Pacific. "Once in Kandahar. Once last week." He shook his head. "You saved yourself, Senior Chief. I just made sure they knew who they were looking at." Captain Reeves approached with papers, reinstatement documents, her records unsealed, an offer to return to active advisory status. Katie looked at them, then at the ICU where patients were waiting, where monitors were humming, where people were coming apart and needed someone steady enough to hold them together. "I think I'm right where I belong, sir," she said. The final shift began at 2,100 hours. Katie walked the unit checking charts, adjusting fours, speaking softly to a frightened patient in room 202 whose daughter was holding her hand. Her movements were precise. Her voice was calm. Her hands, the hands that had held lives together, that had performed needle decompression in front of 6 witnesses, that had carried a child 3 miles through enemy fire, were exactly where they needed to be. If you've made it this far, you understand that sometimes the people saving your life in the hospital at 3 in the morning aren't just nurses, they're heroes whose names are redacted, whose stories are classified, whose sacrifices happen in silence. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about the people the world overlooked. Like this video if you believe quiet strength matters. Comment below, what would you have done in Katie's position? And hit that bell icon so you never miss another story about the warriors among us.